Hey guys, it's Spyros from the Self-Help Photographer. Today I'm going to teach you how to shoot in manual mode. Our question today comes from Frank Gonzalez, who was wondering, how do I shoot a silhouette photograph? To create a silhouette photograph, what you need to do is shoot for the backlight. Normally when you shoot your shot, you focus on the subject and the camera meters off of the subject and exposes for the subject, trying to light that subject correctly so that you can see the details of that person or object, whatever it might be. What you need to do for a silhouette is just the opposite. You need to expose for the light that's in the background, and ideally that light is brighter, much brighter than the subject. For instance, during a sunset or the very brightly lit window. I'm going to demonstrate right here with one of my lights, so let me set it up. Okay, what you're seeing now is a silhouette of me. I've got my video light behind me and the camera is exposing for the video light, throwing me into a complete dark silhouette. It's very simple. Put a bright light behind your subject and expose for the light, not for the subject. Alright, let's talk about shooting in manual mode. And there are three things that we are going to be setting and learning how to set on our cameras. And this is the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. And if you haven't watched my previous videos on those, go watch them. We're going to start with the very easiest step, which is to take your camera and take your mode dial and switch it to the M, which is manual mode. I'm currently in manual mode because that's typically what I shoot. Once you're in manual mode, you need to figure out how to control the different settings. And we're looking again at three settings. First, we're looking for aperture. Now, depending on the camera, this is going to change differently. On my 60D, I have a dial on the back that I can spin, and that changes the aperture for me. D7000s and D90s, higher end cameras like the 7D from Canon, those are going to have a separate dial to change the aperture. On a Nikon 5200, 3100, 3200, on any of the Canon Rebels, there's going to be a button. On the Rebels, that button is going to say AV, and you need to hold that button down and spin a dial in order to change things. On Canon, the control button is going to be on the back, just about where my finger is, where this menu button is. And it will probably have a plus minus symbol on it, and then next to it will be printed the letters AV. What you need to do, Canon users, is hold that button down, and as you're holding it, spin your dial, and that will change your aperture setting. On your Nikons, in order to change the aperture on your lower end Nikons, the aperture button is typically on the top, and it will have that same plus minus symbol that I referenced from the Canons, but next to it will be printed what looks like a little circle with some lines in it, kind of blades, and that represents an aperture. And what you would do for your Nikon is you would hold that button down right here, and you would spin the thumb dial that's typically on the back of your camera. That will allow you to change the aperture. Now, let's move on to the shutter speed. Shutter speed is much easier to change. On your higher end cameras, again, your mid-ranges, like the 60D and up, you're going to have a separate dial. So for me, it's right here. This is my shutter dial. This is my aperture dial. And when I spin this dial on the top of the camera, that changes my shutter speed for me. Nikons have it right here or back right here. And when you spin that dial, one of those changes aperture, the other one changes shutter speed. On your lower end cameras, you use the same dial to change the shutter speed, but you don't push the button that you were pushing to change the aperture. Now take a few moments and just practice changing the aperture and practice changing the shutter speed. Don't worry about what the numbers are right now, and don't worry about the settings for taking the shot. Just get used to changing those. And pause the video, I'll wait for you. Come back when you're ready. Now what we need to do is look at the exposure indicator. And the exposure indicator looks like this. The exposure indicator tells you what the camera thinks is the correct amount of light to capture for an exposure. You have the +2, you have the -2, and then you have that 0 in the middle. And you should have some kind of indicator that jumps around when you're changing the settings, showing you that you're either overexposed when you're on the plus side, in other words, you're getting too much light, or underexposed on the minus side. You're not getting enough light and the picture's going to be darker. When you're at 0, that's what the camera thinks is a perfect exposure. So what I want you to do now is just point the camera at something. Point it at anything. And first set your aperture. And for grins and giggles, set your aperture to its widest open setting, which would be the smallest number. And then set your shutter speed so that the exposure reads for 0. So how did that picture look? It should have been decently exposed, although I know it's not your best picture. Don't worry about that right now, because what we're trying to do is just get the mechanics down. Now, some of you probably got a blurry photo because you had to use a very long shutter speed. This is where the ISO comes in, because sometimes, even if you set your aperture as wide open as possible, like I just had you do by setting it to the lowest number, sometimes it's still too dark to get a fast enough shutter speed to handhold the camera and not get a blurry shot. And that's where the ISO can help you. On pretty much every SLR camera, with the exception of the Nikon 3200, 3100, 5100, and 5200, you will have a dedicated ISO button. Okay, so if you have any Canon SLR, you will have an ISO button. If it's a camera that has this kind of an info screen on the top, like a 60D or above, then your ISO button is right here. If it is a Rebel, then your ISO button is going to be around the little buttons on the back. It may also be on top. On some of the newer models, they've moved it. On your Nikon higher end cameras, the button is usually on the side of the viewfinder and it says ISO, and when you press it, you have to hold it and spin a dial. Whereas on your Canons, you can just push the button and the menu comes up and you can change it. Now on the 3200s, 5100s, those lower end Nikons, you have to go into it a little differently. There's a little I menu button, typically in the bottom corner of your SLR, and that activates the on-screen menu. And then you use your directional pad to navigate to the ISO setting, which typically is the second or third one down on the side of the screen. And then you enter into that to change your ISO. That functionally is how you shoot in manual mode. You take 3 steps, and I always start with the aperture. You don't have to, but I start with the aperture because depth of field is usually my primary concern in the shot. Most people usually go for depth of field, and if you don't know what that is, watch the aperture video. Then I set the shutter speed, and if the shutter speed is fast enough that I'm going to get a sharp shot, I don't have to change my ISO. But if the shutter speed is too slow to get a sharp shot when I hold the camera, and that's typically going to be at least 1/50th or up to get a good shot. If it's below 1/50th of a second, too slow. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, watch the shutter speed video. After that, if I need to, I change my ISO, and if not, I shoot. Now, that's all I've got for you guys today. I want you to practice this. I want you to practice these settings and shooting at a 0 exposure and just getting used to setting these things. And then next week, we're going to talk about making aesthetic choices and how to use these controls to override the camera so that we can take the kind of pictures that we want to take. So, practice. Send me your questions to Spyros at selfhelpphotographer.com or facebook.com/selfhelpphotographer, and get out there and take some damn pictures. My camera is a machine gun!